what to talk about today. Oops. Okay, gotta click this little thing that says recording is in progress. Great. All right. As I was saying, how do you choose what to talk about when you have so many interesting, fascinating moments in San Francisco, California, and of course, the United States? We're going to focus on the national scene today, and let's begin with the obvious, the question of Joe Biden. I'm going to try to divide this up between Joe Biden and Donald Trump and the potential for a vice presidential candidate. We'll do all of that and more. So the first is Joe Biden. Those of you who watched the debate, which I would not call a debate, it was really a joint appearance, I'm sure came away with the same impression that I had. Joe Biden was the big loser in large measure because of his inability to respond. He simply was not up to the task. It doesn't mean Donald Trump was the winner. Donald Trump told at least 30 lies, which were clear and apparent and ever present. But what people focus on is what you look like. And I want to remind you of the Nixon-Kennedy debate, the first debate, back in 1960, when you will recall Richard Nixon walked into the studio wearing a gray suit, a white shirt, and a light tie. JFK came in a dark suit, a appropriate tie. He looked great. He looked rested. And Nixon looked very shifty. And as a result, although Nixon won the first debate on the radio, on television he lost, and he never really recovered, despite later successes in his joint appearances with John F. Kennedy. The simple truth is that how a person looks is important, but also how a person responds. And what we saw with Joe Biden was a man who seemed unable to respond to the moment. This is one of the most interesting moments in the history of American politics. And let me back up and explain that once upon a time, we didn't necessarily know who the candidate for president would be until after the convention. Let me point out to you that in 1940, Wendell Willkie was a dark horse who won the nomination for the presidency for the Republican Party. In 1952, Adlai Stevenson was a dark horse who won the nomination. And these were unexpected nominations. These were not the predicted nominations, but there was plenty of time to prepare. What we are finding in this situation is now a great debate over Joe Biden. So let me first of all establish the fact that if I had been Joe Biden, rather than in the George Stephanopoulos interview declining to have a thorough physical and cognitive testing, I would have agreed to it. Joe Biden said no. He says you have all the information you want. And frankly, he said, every day I'm in a cognitive test. It's not good enough. And even though Joe Biden is clearly going to be the Democratic nominee for president, and let me make clear that he has made clear that he is going to run, he has won the delegates necessary to win the nomination. There's no question about it. And the delegates do not have freedom of action, meaning that as long as Joe Biden says the delegates are his, he will be the nominee. And no matter what people say or feel or think, in order for there to be a change, Joe Biden would have to relinquish his delegates. The odds of that happening, based on what Joe Biden has said, are virtually nil. So I'm going to stick my neck out. And remember, we have 4 sessions to go and a lot can happen. But as of today, this hour, Joe Biden will be the Democratic nominee for president. Now, there's all the speculation about what alternatives the Democrats have. So let me be clear. There is only one choice the Democrats have, if not Joe Biden, and that is Kamala Harris. If he, for any reason, is not the nominee of the party, Kamala will be. The suggestion this morning by James Carville and several others that Bill Clinton and Barack Obama get together and figure out who the Democrats should nominate as an alternative mean absolutely nothing. And I can assure you, and you can watch it in everything Joe Biden does, he puts his arm around Kamala Harris, or figuratively speaking, literally speaking, he says, we're a team. And that means that Kamala Harris will be the nominee for vice president. And if anything happens to Joe Biden, he will be the nominee. And if anything happens to him, she would be the next nominee. There is no truth to the rumor that a Gavin Newsom or a Governor Whitmer or any other Democrat might emerge. There is no room in the way the parties are structured now. As for the question of an open convention requires that you have favorite son candidates, uncommitted delegates, the whole 9 yards. That doesn't exist in the American political system today. So I'm going to stick my neck out and tell you the ticket will be Biden and Harris. They will be nominated. Now the question you have to ask is, how do the American people feel about Joe Biden running for another term? Based on his performance as president over the last 3.5 years, if you are a Democrat, you're thrilled. His record has been stellar. His ability to communicate ideas and get legislation passed has been great. But the question is not now. The question is, what will Joe Biden be like in 3.5 years? And that's the question that people are grappling with. And it's a serious question. And it's something that Joe Biden and the Democrats have to wrestle with. You can be certain that the Republicans will run ads showing Joe Biden at his weakest. They will show him trailing off. Now, people ask me about these joint appearances. Do you remember when Ronald Reagan debated Walter Mondale in the first debate in 1984? If you remember, in that first debate, Reagan failed miserably. In fact, his concluding statement was one of the poorest concluding statements I've ever heard by a candidate for president. And the Mondale people really believed that they might overtake Ronald Reagan and win the election. But in the second joint appearance, Ronald Reagan came back with that quick line, "I won't hold my opponent's youth and inexperience against him." And everyone laughed, including Walter Mondale. The tragedy of Joe Biden was that his closing statement was nothing. It had no impact at all. Now, understand, I'm not here as a partisan. You understand that's not my goal or what you've asked me to do. I happen to be a Democrat. I happen to be a Joe Biden supporter. I happen to know Joe Biden, and I like Joe Biden very much. But I'm trying to speak with complete objectivity. There is concern in the Democratic Party about Joe Biden. So let me take it a step further. Let's assume that Joe Biden is nominated by the Democrats at the August convention, and that something then happens to Joe Biden between the convention and the election. The Democrats will not reassemble. They will not reassemble a convention. What will happen is the Democratic National Committee will make the choice of who the Democratic candidate for president might be. Let me point out that has happened once before in our history, and that was in 1972 when Tom Eagleton, the Democratic nominee for vice president, dropped out after the convention, and then the National Committee met to select the candidate. My feeling, and you never know in politics, anything can happen. But I will tell you that if Joe Biden is not on the ticket, it will be Kamala Harris as the nominee for president. Now, the good news for the Democrats is that the polls indicate that Kamala runs as strongly as does Joe Biden. The disadvantage is that the negatives about Kamala Harris are real, and everyone knows them, particularly if you watch Fox. Please note, I don't say Fox News. That would be an oxymoron. Fox has a particular bias, and that is made evident every time I turn on Fox. So my sense now is that unless something dramatic happens, Joe Biden will be the Democratic nominee for president. Kamala Harris will be the Democratic nominee for vice president. Let me also point out that the polls are very interesting. As disastrous as Biden's appearance was last week, the most interesting thing for me is the polls still show it very close. And if you're taking a look at the polls, as I did this morning, from the swing states, Joe Biden is very much in this race. So let's put the Democrats aside. I know you'll come back with a lot of questions, and let's turn to the Republicans. The Republicans will nominate Donald Trump for president of the United States. On the ellipse on January 6th, Donald Trump Jr. said, "It is no longer the Republican Party, it is the party of Donald Trump." And that is clearly the truth. You will note that Republicans have written a platform. They're proposing a platform for their convention. Well, I have a book of the various platforms adopted by political parties since their very beginning. Let me tell you, when I can't sleep at night, I just open the book. Dull reading. And by the way, no platform really matters, because what only matters is what the president or the candidate for president says or does. I would remind you that the most conservative platform ever adopted by a political party was in 1932 by the Democrats. In fact, Barry Goldwater once proclaimed he would have felt very comfortable running on the Democratic platform of 1932. The point is that when you read that platform, and you can look it up, you will see that Franklin Roosevelt, who was elected president and became president, had no regard for that platform. It made absolutely no difference. So the idea that a platform makes a difference is ridiculous. But what is clear is that it is now the party of Donald Trump. Now, the question is, who will his running mate be? And by the time we meet next week, we will know the answer to that question. It appears to me that there are three top contenders. Marco Rubio, who is appearing at a rally with Donald Trump at some time today. The problem is that the Constitution forbids the electoral votes being cast for a candidate for president and vice president from the same state. And so if Marco Rubio is the nominee of the Republican Party for vice president, it will create a problem because both of them are registered to vote in Florida. The other two potential candidates are Doug Burgum, who ran a very brief run. He is the governor, as you know, of a small state, North Dakota. And by the way, I think he fits what Donald Trump really wants. He's relatively innocuous, has a very low visibility nationally, and as a result, he represents someone who could be the leading candidate. The other one is J.D. Vance of Ohio. The advantage to J.D. Vance is that he's from Ohio, and Ohio is a swing state. The disadvantage to J.D. Vance is that he is rather outspoken and was an election denier and has become a Trump acolyte. Let me be crystal clear on this. Doug Burgum, Marco Rubio, or J.D. Vance all represent possible nominees for vice president. I thought that the strongest candidate might be Elise Stefanik, who is the number 3 Republican in the House of Representatives. She succeeded Liz Cheney. I don't see her now as a viable candidate because she's not being speculated about as much as she might have been. So I can't tell you who the nominee will be. There's one other name I have to throw out, and that's Tim Scott. And the reason I throw out Tim Scott is because he most assuredly wants to be the nominee for vice president. He is an African-American, and there is a lot of thought that if the African-American vote can be reduced for Biden, that it would help Donald Trump. Tim Scott clearly is in the running for the place as well. So we have to wait and see what happens. In the end, the vice presidential nominee is selected by the candidate for president. All the convention does is to ratify the decision. So we will see that shortly. Frankly, if I were a betting man today, I would say that Governor Burgum should be the favorite because he brings the least disadvantage to the ticket. And what you want when you're running for president is the least negative that you can possibly get. Does it matter who the vice presidential nominee is on the Republican ticket? The answer is no. People don't vote for a vice president, they vote for a president. And so even though Donald Trump, if he is reelected as president, would be in his 80s when his term expires, most people are not going to pay attention to that particular aspect. So that is really the only mystery left for the Republican National Convention to deal with. Will there be any battles at the National Convention, which convenes in just a few days? It appears that they have agreed on Donald Trump's position on the right of a woman to choose, which is to turn that back to the states. And as a result, the whole issue seems to be diffused unless somebody brings it to the floor. But I don't think Donald Trump will permit any floor battles at the Republican National Convention. Let's take it a step further. What would happen if Donald Trump should, for some reason, not be the nominee? Again, the rules are very clear. The Republican National Convention having adjourned, it would be the Republican National Committee that would make the choice. So where do we stand? Where we stand at the moment is we are going to have a race between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the fact that Donald Trump has been convicted of 34 felony charges. He's also been convicted of sexual harassment and more. He is a man who faces a number of criminal proceedings, including the question of papers that were top security papers, which were found at Mar-a-Lago. And also, he, of course, faces the charges about January 6th. The Trump team has, through, I think, a very wise judgment on their part, simply chosen to delay everything. And the question you have to ask is, what if Trump wins and there are no trials? All federal charges will be dropped because Donald Trump will essentially have them dropped, and he will have that power. He cannot eliminate state charges, you understand? So a case like Georgia continues to thrive. A quick word, if I can, about the Supreme Court of the United States. All of you know that I worked for Richard Nixon. I taught a course for the OLLI on the life and times of Richard Nixon and went into it at great length. Let me simply say the Supreme Court decision last week dealing with presidential immunity was a terrible blow to American democracy. I am reminded that when Warren Burger wrote the case, the majority opinion for the United States versus Richard Nixon, which I would remind you was decided by an 8-0 vote with one recusal, that was Bill Rehnquist. My old friend Bill Rehnquist recused himself because he knew everybody who was involved in Watergate. That the whole point of Warren Burger was a president has immunity, but not if a president breaks the law. And that is going to be the question, because what the Supreme Court did was to return to the lower court the question of whether or not the president broke the law. That's going to be the real question. Donald Trump may skate on everything. He may skate because if he's elected, these charges will never be heard. I want to say a word about what Donald Trump's intention is in a second term. All of you know that he's now distancing himself from Project 2025, which is a Heritage Foundation suggestion of what a second Trump term might look like. It is a radical document, which I have read in depth, but what Donald Trump is basically saying is, it doesn't matter what a think tank says, it only matters what I say. And that's true, except that the people who wrote this particular document will certainly be key players in a Trump administration. What does this mean for the American people? It means that the American people will have to make a clear choice, a choice between the vision of a Donald Trump versus the vision of a Joe Biden. What do the polls show? The polls show the country virtually evenly divided. And that's stunning, particularly if you live in Northern California, where there is not much support for Donald Trump. But understand that in the rest of the country, it's a fascinating phenomenon. But Trump is believed, and the people who believe in Donald Trump believe 100% in Donald Trump. We can look forward in the presidential debate upcoming in the beginning of October, rather beginning of September, to a real battle, because Joe Biden will have to establish that he can stand on a stage and really perform. We've never had a campaign for president where one of the contenders, who happens to be the incumbent president of the United States, has to be able to stand on a stage for 90 minutes and be able to speak articulately, clearly, passionately. And you understand that is Joe Biden's challenge. Now, as you know, a neurologist visited the White House. The neurologist's specialty is Parkinson's disease. I've had a lot of experience with Parkinson's. I had an uncle and 2 first cousins who were afflicted with Parkinson's. When I look at Joe Biden, that's what I see, by the way. I see the same vacant look, the same inability to articulate clearly. But I want you to know the neurologists, at least what the White House are citing, say that he does not have Parkinson's. He is not on L-Dopa or any other Parkinson's-related treatment. What does that mean? It means that if that is the statement being made by the White House, in the end, it won't come down to doctors. It will come down to us, the American people. The closest analogy I can think of was 1955, when Dwight Eisenhower had a massive heart attack when he was visiting his mother-in-law in Denver. And he used to joke the fact that he was visiting his mother-in-law and that he had a heart attack had nothing to do with each other. He loved his mother-in-law. But what is clear is that when Eisenhower had his heart attack, Paul Dudley White, one of the leading physicians, cardiologists in the country, held a press conference which was broadcast nationally. I listened to it again yesterday, in which every question the media could possibly have asked was related about Dwight Eisenhower's condition. And in the end, the American people reelected Ike in 1956, and Eisenhower actually did not die until 1969, meaning that he not only lived out his second term, but theoretically, if it had been possible, the 22nd Amendment precluded it, he could have been reelected to a third term and survived. I want you all to consider carefully that one of the things that we are going to be looking for in the days ahead will be what the president's physicians say. How candid will they be? What will our observations be? And I don't know about you, but I will be listening tonight when President Biden speaks to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and when he holds a full-blown press conference on Thursday. These are critical moments. Now, some of you are asking, but John, why are you emphasizing Biden and not Trump? Well, today, I have no choice but to emphasize Biden. And for the next few days, that's what we're going to focus on. We will focus on Trump next week during the Republican National Convention, who he chooses for vice president, what the final platform statements are, what the keynote speakers say, how Donald Trump's team surrounding him reacts. But today, the whole world is focused on Joe Biden. He is not only the president of the United States, he is the leader of the free world. I was shocked during the George Stephanopoulos interview last Friday evening that Joe Biden declined to say he would take a cognitive test. I think he's obligated to take a cognitive test. It can't be ordered, it can't be required, but otherwise you're leaving it to speculation by the American people and by commentators, people like me. So this is going to be one of the more interesting dynamics. Now, let me say a word about down ballot. There is no question but that the next president of the United States will be filling vacancies on the Supreme Court. When I say that, a president doesn't appoint. That word is not correct. A president nominates. The Senate has the power of advise and consent, and only the Senate. So who controls the United States Senate will be critical. We saw that when Barack Obama nominated Merrick Garland for the Supreme Court, and the issue never came to the US Senate because the then Senate Republican leader and current Senate Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, wouldn't bring it. He said, we're too close to an election. Of course, when it came to the vacancy, which occurred just recently, he didn't care how close we were to the election. He just went ahead. And I think you can talk about hypocrisy in politics, but the simple fact is that presidents have a lasting impact. And so when we vote in November, I would suggest to you, we will not just be voting for a president, we'll be voting for the Supreme Court, the appellate courts, the federal district courts, and what kind of judge will sit on those courts. I'm always reminded of my old friend Shirley Breyer Black, who was Stephen Breyer's aunt, who would constantly remind me that if Al Gore had been elected president, it would not be the Roberts Court, she used to say to me, it would have been the Breyer Court because he would have been elevated to be Chief Justice. So I say this again, there are real issues here. Let me say a word about foreign policy, just because I think that is another critical role. The NATO meeting, this is the 75th anniversary of NATO, and you all know who the first Supreme Allied Commander of NATO was, Dwight D. Eisenhower. And I would remind you that Eisenhower chose to run for the Republican nomination in 1952, when coming to Washington in 51, his leading opponent would have been Bob Taft, who was in favor of disbanding NATO. And as a result of that statement, Eisenhower decided to run for president. And he ran and he won. And thank God, NATO is today the strongest alliance, frankly, of superpowers in the history of the world. And would Donald Trump withdraw from NATO? Or would he downgrade NATO? And the answer is, it appears that he would. And that is a serious question for our NATO allies, who are all very worried. You all know that the Russians are now hitting Ukraine even harder. They just used a new weapon which devastated the Children's Hospital in Kyiv. And this is a devastating blow. And the question is, how will the West respond? President Biden has agreed that weapons of the United States can be used by the Ukrainians in the war against Russia. But what are the implications of that? This is fascinating. Modi, the Prime Minister of India, is visiting with Putin. And did you see their embrace today? And have you watched carefully to see the Russian reaction on a whole host of levels? So NATO is going to be critical, and where we stand with NATO. There is another possibility that I want to raise very quickly. They're talking about some sort of an agreement for a truce in the Middle East, not peace, but truce. I would suggest to you, and we'll see whether I'm proven right, that the odds of a deal between Hamas and Israel, which, by the way, they're not talking directly, it's all around the way negotiation, will probably not succeed. And more than that, I hope you're looking at Hezbollah in Lebanon, which has resulted in the attacks on Israel and more than 80,000 Israelis having to evacuate their homes in northern Israel. No one talks about it, but it's a serious question. So foreign policy remains front and center. I need not remind you of the results of the French election, where the right wing won the initial round, the left wing won the secondary round. I talked to friends of mine in Paris the other day who explained to me that the reason the left won was because people are afraid of the right. So they're trying to balance each other out. The loser, Macron, whose term of office continues until his term expires, but who has now suffered a tremendous defeat, both from the left and the right. And so we're watching carefully what happens in France. And by the way, Europe is watching what is going to happen. And all of this should be at the front of the agenda in our discussion about candidates for president. We shouldn't be having to debate whether Joe Biden is up to the task or whether Donald Trump, having been convicted of crimes as a convicted felon, should be president of the United States. We should be discussing, debating, and analyzing the great issues that confront America. Let me point out to you that there's another factor which will become more and more evident, and we'll probably talk about this after the Republican convention, is who are the people around Donald Trump? Were he to be president of the United States, who would be his Secretary of State? Who would be his representative to NATO? All of these questions are critical, and we have no guarantee that we will have any answers, but there'll be a lot of speculation. The one thing we know is that Donald Trump will not make the same mistakes in a second term that he made in his first term. He has been president of the United States. He has a greater sense of the levers of power. And so that is going to be very important as well. Let's talk for a minute then about the battle within the political parties, because both Trump and Biden, this is their last presidential election where they can truly be impactful. There is no doubt in my mind that this will be a clash between two men who have particular visions of what America should be. And that will be part of the choice the American people make. I want to observe that I do a lot of talking with people. I like to listen, and I listen very carefully. And I want to be crystal clear on this too. The people who support Donald Trump support him down the line. Nothing that will happen at the Republican convention will break that hold that Donald Trump has over the Republican Party. It doesn't matter who the vice presidential nominee is. Let me remind you, people don't vote for a vice president, they vote for a president. And so Donald Trump really has free reign. But both the Democrats and the Republicans have a real challenge. If this is the last hurrah for Biden and Trump in national politics, the question becomes, what will the fate be of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party under new leadership? And who will that new leadership be? Of course, that's a bridge we have to cross after we deal with this election cycle, because right now, these are the two personalities that we're dealing with. Now, I know that there will be a question about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the third party factor. I do not view Bobby Kennedy Jr. as a creditable candidate for president. He simply is not. Will people vote for him? Perhaps because of his name. I want to point out that it also depends on where he is on the ballot. Right now, I think, as of this morning, and I checked, he's on the ballot in 6 states. But were he to have a greater ballot presence, who would that hurt more, the Democrats or the Republicans? Would it hurt Trump or would it hurt Biden? And evidently, it hurts Trump more. That is what the polls indicate. But whatever the case may be, the third party option in this country clearly is not viable. And we saw that when a group of political leaders got together to try to launch a genuine third party effort. And in the end, they abandoned it because they felt it just wasn't viable. So I would suggest to you that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is a marginal character in all of this, but we're going to have to watch in terms of polling whether or not he can make a difference in key states. Now, I should also address the question of popular vote versus electoral vote. And I'll probably do this again in the last lecture. And Kellum and I were just talking about my coming back to do commentary in September, October, and into November, which I'll be happy to do. We have to remember that although Al Gore and Hillary Clinton, just to use 2 examples, won the popular vote, they lost the electoral vote. And so it will all boil down to about 5 states. By the way, somebody asked me if Kamala Harris were the nominee for president, who would she take as her vice presidential running mate? I said Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania. Why? He's extremely popular in Pennsylvania. He's a very able leader, and he might bring Pennsylvania into the Democratic column. So there are a lot of things that are unpredictable, a lot of things that are at play that all you can do is speculate. But, and let me sort of wrap up my formal presentation, because I know you all have questions, and I am going to stay and try to answer each and every one of them. This election really is about a choice. And it is a choice between an 81-year-old enfeebled president, and you don't get better, you understand, when you have those kind of reactions. You all know that, right? We're in an age where we understand the limitations of age, versus someone who is a convicted felon, but whose stage presence and whose articulation of issues is very clear and appeals to a part of the country. I want to be completely fair in doing this, to point out that it's almost a Hobson's choice. How do you decide? And I was with some people this weekend who believe that Donald Trump is much better than Joe Biden, and who believe that Joe Biden is simply not capable of being president. And when Joe Biden says, but I have a record of 3.5 years and it's a stellar record, it's not enough, because it's not what he's done now. You know the old expression, it's what you do for your constituents tomorrow. What will Joe Biden be like in 3.5 years? And everybody has to think about that. The presidency of the United States, and I've taught a course at OLLI on 20th century American presidents, just dealing with the 20th century. Presidents of the United States make a huge difference. It matters who's president. It matters who surrounds a president. It matters whether or not a president is compos mentis and able to articulate. The president of the United States is more than the commander-in-chief. He is the articulator-in-chief. And so this is, again, the fundamental question the American people will have to resolve. All right, let me stop. It doesn't mean I'm stopping and I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to answer all your questions. And this may set me off on a whole new tangent, so I can hardly wait. Fire away.
Okay, thank you, John. Here we go. First question is from Henry, I believe. Talk about why the media is after Biden and not pointing out Trump's lies and not answering questions and Trump's lies and not answering questions and his past and his plans. Just a total pass for Trump.
Because Joe Biden is president of the United States. Because Joe Biden appeared on television and appeared, I won't say incoherent, but not competent to do the job. And we have a very interesting media. What do I talk about? How do I choose to talk about things? It's what people are interested in. If you're a radio talk show host, as I was for many years, or you're in television news, what you're doing is you're trying to pick up on what people are interested in. We all know what Trump is, and we're going to hear a lot about Trump in the fall. And we all know about his felony convictions, and we all know about his sexual harassment charges, and we all know all of those things. But when you have Joe Biden, the sitting president of the United States, in a debate, joint appearance, when, you know, the most telling line for me in the whole thing was when Donald Trump said, I don't think he knows what he said, and I certainly don't know what he said. And you know what? I didn't know what Joe Biden said either. That's the problem. And so what do people emphasize? They emphasize what is immediate and clear. Trump isn't off the hook. And by the way, take a look at the polling. You would think after that abysmal performance by Joe Biden that Trump would have surged into a dramatic lead. Quite the contrary. The polls have not really shifted all that much, which tells me that we are going to be highlighting not anything more or less than the failures of candidates for president. If Donald Trump messes up, that will be emphasized. Of course, understand, it will be emphasized on some networks and not on others. When you listen to Fox, you get a whole different view of America than when you listen to CNN or MSNBC. And that's the reality. We don't have a Cronkite or a Huntley Brinkley or a Frank Reynolds. We don't have that kind of neutrality. So I know Trump will be held accountable in the November election. Let me just point something else out to you. There is a wonderful website called The Living Room Candidate. Make a note of it, The Living Room Candidate. It takes ads in presidential campaigns going back to 1952. And you can choose which ads you want to listen to. They're absolutely marvelous, these ads. But you will see in this campaign, the real battle will be over ads. It'll be how hours are purchased. God, I wish I owned a radio or television station in one of the swing states. They're going to be inundated. They'll be, in clover. So to answer the question succinctly, and I apologize for going on too long, you're going to hear a lot about Donald Trump and the problems of Donald Trump. But right now, everything focuses on the president of the United States and his competence to be president.
Thanks, John. I have to editorialize a little bit here, if I may. People didn't understand what Biden said. It's true. Most of us didn't understand. We all understood exactly what Trump said, and we knew that it was almost complete lies and exaggeration.
But that's you, Kellum. You see, I was at a dinner party over the weekend. I was up in Napa with people who are extremely bright and believed everything Trump told them. So we have to take ourselves out of where we live and what we would normally think. Look, I'm a partisan, but in my presentation today and over the next 3 weeks, I have to be reasonably fair. And Donald Trump is going to score points, particularly at this Republican convention. A convention is no longer a convention. A convention is a place where they advertise their positions. And generally after a convention, you have a bounce, which means the Republicans theoretically should have a bounce after this coming week. But remember, the Democrats have a convention in August, and they will be able to make a case. But that's why, Kellum, I'm so careful I know what Donald Trump is and what he represents to me, but the fact that I could convey that doesn't explain how the majority of the American people feel. And what you've seen in this case of Joe Biden is even his supporters, even people closest to him, even people like me, and I've known Joe Biden 35 years, 40 years, were deeply disturbed by what they saw on the stage. And that to me is the simple truth.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Next question then. Nancy asks, if Biden consents to a cognitive test, won't Trump get the results secretly? Or if not, he will really slander Joe. I
Well,
like Joe, but maybe because of this, he should lay low, Nancy says.
No, look, if Biden has to take a cognitive test for all the American people to see, so should Trump. Anything Biden does, Trump should do as well. So the American people can really have a true assessment of the physical and mental condition. There is clearly something wrong with Joe Biden, okay? And I'm a Biden supporter. I'm not here to give you a pablum. There is clearly something. And those of you who live with people who have Parkinson's or people who are elderly or people who are sort of losing it, that's what we saw. And that image will never be erased from the minds of Americans, no matter what their political views are. I talked with one leading Democrat who is very close to Joe Biden, who loves Joe Biden, who said to me, John, we're worried about him. And they should be. We should be. What do you want as a president of the United States of America, by God? What you want as a president is someone who is clear, decisive, powerful. Why did Trump, whatever you think of what he said it in a decisive fashion.
Mm-hmm.
Contrast that with Joe Biden. Next question.
Okay, Barney Weiss says, don't you think that Donald Trump should also be required to take a cognitive test?
Yes.
You just answered that. He's showing early symptoms of Alzheimer's, the same that I've seen in others who have eventually succumbed to this disease.
I don't know. I'm not a doctor. I'm not an expert. I can tell you that I have dealt with people with dementia. I have dealt with people who have Parkinson's disease. Unfortunately, as I said, my uncle and two first cousins, I've seen that vacant stare before. Does it apply to Donald Trump? Well, Donald Trump couldn't remember who he was talking about. Nancy Pelosi, he kept saying, have this and that. It wasn't Nancy Pelosi at all. And he confused Nancy Pelosi with the former governor of South Carolina when she was running for president. Look, this is not the optimal decision. In 1960, Richard Nixon was 47 years old and John F. Kennedy was 43 years old. These were two young men. Nobody accused them of not having all of their marbles. And I would suggest the same thing in recent political campaigns. You know, I think I mentioned this last time I spoke to OLLI. This is the last presidential campaign in which I will be younger than both candidates for president. And all of us understand the impact of age. Let me make one other comment about that. The last thing anyone wants to do is to say that they don't have the ability to function. My father-in-law, 5 years before he died, decided not to manage the family's investments. He turned it over to his son. It was a remarkable demonstration of courage because my father-in-law identified when he knew he couldn't do it anymore. But how many of us know people who won't admit that? My uncle, another uncle, was driving and he shouldn't have been driving. And we finally reported him to the DMV because he didn't want to voluntarily give up his driver's license. It takes a lot of courage to say to someone you love that you're not able anymore. Now, I'm very concerned about Donald Trump as well. He is a congenital liar, in my judgment. This is not a new development. What is shocking to me is that his supporters ignore that. Look, do you know, I had a discussion with someone just this last week about Donald Trump and his attitudes toward retribution and revenge. And I was told He never said that. I said it's in his Twitter. Well, he didn't say it. Well, if you listen to him on Sean Hannity's program, what you saw was Sean Hannity giving him every opportunity to say he didn't mean it, and he didn't do it. Donald Trump, of course, is after retribution and revenge. Do you think you want a president of the United States who would do that? By the way, if Joe Biden indicated he wanted retribution and revenge, I would be just as upset. I worked for Richard Nixon, for heaven's sake. I know what an enemies list is. I know what it means when you go after someone with retribution. There is a wonderful book called The Plot That Failed. It's about what Nixon envisioned for a second term in terms of control of government. It's the same thing the Donald Trump people are proposing. And it should scare every American. Can you imagine they want to have a loyalty test, some of the people around Trump, for civil servants? Can you imagine that? And where is the media criticism? Where is the outrage? I think we have become so used to the question of Donald Trump's abuse of language and power that it doesn't make headlines anymore. And I will say the same thing about Joe Biden. There have been signs of Joe Biden's cognitive decline. All of us have seen them. I mean, you don't have to listen to right-wing radio and television to see it. But people don't want to talk about it. But there ought to be a full, frank discussion. And that's why, going back to the question, I believe both candidates should undergo full physicals with full cognitive awareness before an election, so the American people know. And I am very upset, and I don't mind saying this to you, that the American political process, given the way we hold conventions today, does not allow for that kind of reflection. The delegates are locked in. They are legally committed. You cannot have an open convention anymore. I prefer an open convention. I preferred the day when there were favorite son candidates for president. I preferred the day when there were party bosses who made certain determinations. May I remind you, and I do this respectfully, that Henry Wallace was vice president in 1944. But a lot of Democrats felt he just wasn't up to being president. But his ideology was wrong, and his guru letters and stuff, all the things that he was corresponding with one of those mystics, all these things hurt him. And a group of Democratic leaders went to Franklin Roosevelt and essentially said, we don't want Wallace. Harry Truman was the Missouri Compromise, as they said in those days. And nobody knew who Harry Truman was. But there was a feeling, and the Democratic convention could still react. And there was a multi-ballot vote for vice president at the Democratic convention of 1944. People don't remember the dynamic of a political convention. My political heroes, Republican Wendell Willkie, Democrat Adlai Stevenson, they emerged because of deadlocked conventions that nobody thought they would be the nominees. Our convention process does not allow for that today. Now, it doesn't mean the older system was better. We all remember Mayor Daley at the 1968 Democratic Convention. Do you remember Hubert Humphrey was nominated having not competed in primaries? The last time a candidate for president was selected who didn't run on a primary. It worked out okay because Humphrey was an able man, but that was the toss of the die. And that's what happens when you deal with these political matters, except now we're locked in. I'm sorry, I went on a little long, but I want to explain it. And by the way, you can ask me any historical question along these lines, so I'm happy to answer them. I don't think history repeats itself, but I think we can learn from history.
You bet we can. Okay, thank you. Next one is from Louise. If Biden wins the election and he fails more in his cognitive ability, how difficult will it be to move on to Kamala Harris?
Well, that goes back to the 25th Amendment, which I discussed at great length with you during the Trump presidency. Under the 25th Amendment, and I urge you to read it, it's a very interesting amendment to the Constitution. The vice president and the president's cabinet can relieve a president of their responsibilities with a majority vote of the cabinet. The president has the right to reclaim their duties, but highly unusual. We've used the 25th Amendment twice in our history. Once when Spiro Agnew resigned, and Nelson Rockefeller was nominated, rather Gerald Ford was nominated. And then when Gerald Ford became president, when he nominated Nelson Rockefeller, that was the process of the 25th Amendment, which ensured that we would never be without a vice president. But I would remind you that it resulted in the only time in American history when an unelected president and an unelected vice president were both serving, Ford and Rockefeller. So, you know, there are upsides and downsides to everything, but that would require the 25th Amendment, which takes that into account. May I also remind you, nobody asked me about the role of Jill Biden. Do you remember the presidentress? Aha! I knew you wouldn't. Edith Bowling Galt Wilson. Woodrow Wilson had a stroke in 1919, and the government was run by Mrs. Wilson. It's a fascinating story. They called her the presidentress. She said that she never made any decisions. She just decided what President Wilson could see, and then she announced the decision. We had government, as they called it in those days, by petticoat. By the way, very capable. And if you take a look at the 1961 inauguration of John F. Kennedy, you'll see a little old lady all bundled up sitting at the inauguration. It was Mrs. Edith Wilson. The simple fact is that Jill Biden has a tremendous amount of impact on Joe Biden. They are partners. That is not a bad thing. Nancy Reagan had a huge impact on Ronald Reagan. I would say Hillary Clinton had a huge impact, some positive, some negative, when it came to Bill Clinton. Michelle Obama most assuredly had an impact on her husband. Eleanor Roosevelt certainly had that impact. Some of you will remember the course I taught for OLLI and for the From on first ladies. So I respect Jill Biden. I think she is a wonderful, positive force in her husband's life, and they are partners. That's the way it is.
You didn't mention Melania.
I didn't mention Melania because I don't think she was a decisive first lady in terms of impacting her husband, nor have we seen her on the campaign trail. I could be wrong, but I think that is the general impression we have of Melania Trump. And I don't think that Melania and Donald are as close as other presidents and first ladies have been. I mean, that's just my observation, which may mean absolutely nothing because I'm not in their bedroom. So I can't tell you what they do in their spare time.
Thanks. Next one is from Bob and Diane. Is it possible to have term limits in SCOTUS? And if so, how is the Senate involved, if at all?
There is no chance for term limits with SCOTUS unless a law was passed to that effect. That's not going to happen, so you can just put it aside. As to the question of impeaching a justice, and I know you're speaking immediately, although you did it very diplomatically, about Justice Alito and Justice Thomas, who clearly have conflicts. No one can force a Supreme Court justice to recuse him or herself. Bill Rehnquist recused himself in the Nixon case, and he explained why he did it. It's very unusual for a recusal. And as to impeachment, there has been only one Supreme Court justice impeached in American history, and that was Samuel Chase, and that goes back to 1805. And although he was impeached, he was not convicted in that trial, which was presided over, by the way, by a lame duck vice president who had murdered the former Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, and that's Aaron Burr. That gives you another sense of history. Fascinating subject, but no. When we want Supreme Court justices out, well, I'll use several examples. I could use several examples, but Abe Fortas left the Supreme Court because Earl Warren and some of the brothers said, "You've embarrassed the court. You have to go." And Abe Fortas did go. By the way, he accepted $20,000 from the Wolfson Foundation. It makes what Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito have done look like child's play. It's absolutely ridiculous. And we had a case of a Supreme Court justice who was senile, and in the end, he died before he was forced off the bench. I mean, these are the practical realities. A Supreme Court justice is essentially a king. That is to say, he makes his own decisions or she makes her own decisions. I would remind you that Sandra Day O'Connor, who was the first woman to serve on the Supreme Court, resigned voluntarily when her husband had Alzheimer's to take care of him in a selfless act. And I only point that out because, again, nobody can be forced to leave the court.
Okay, John, thank you. Next, Linda has a couple of questions here. What are the swing states that decide the electoral vote? And is there any viable movement to reform or eliminate the electoral college?
Well, let me deal with the second one first. It would require a constitutional amendment to eliminate the electoral college. There have been some who have suggested that there be an agreement between the states that if a candidate wins a majority of the popular vote, they automatically get the electoral vote. But that's just an agreement between the states. There's no guarantee anybody would observe it. As you know, there are 2 states in which congressional districts decide the electoral vote. And I would suggest to you that's very unusual. Nebraska and Maine, where it's decided by a congressional district, but I think that's very unusual. It's not the norm. If that had applied, Richard Nixon would have been elected in 1960 over John F. Kennedy because Nixon carried more congressional districts than John F. Kennedy. So, you know, there are pluses and minuses on all these things. As to your second question, repeat it just so everybody knows it, will you?
Just a sec. What are the swing states that decide the electoral vote?
I just wanted you to hear that directly from Kellum. Right now, I would say Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Nevada. Those are the 4 that I think are really critical.
How about Michigan?
Yeah, Michigan. I'm sorry, did I leave out Michigan? Sure. So make it 5 states. They're the swing states. That's where all the money's going to go. It's important because that's how we choose our president. So those 5 states are the states I'll be watching, and I can assure you that in September, October, November, when I'm speaking, I will be citing the latest polls out of those states. By the way, it's possible, and let me remind you that the last Republican candidate for president to win the popular vote was George W. Bush in 2004. No Republican candidate for president has won a popular majority. It's always been by the Electoral College.
Okay, thank you. Henry is asking, why do you, that is you, and the media have to be fair as in both sides-ism? The Times, the Post, and other media are not being fair as they clearly push Trump.
Well, if you invited me here to be a partisan, I would be a partisan. I wasn't invited to do that with you. I was invited to give you an analysis, which is what I do traditionally, but you're absolutely right. There is no requirement today that the media be neutral. We don't have an equal time provision anymore, which we once had. Most news directors don't, they just want you to attract listeners. So when I listen to Sean Hannity or Mark Levin or Laura Ingraham, who are very popular right-wing talk show hosts, no one asks them to be fair. There's no supervision. They're judged completely by their ratings. And frankly, when it comes to news, that's the same thing. People ask me, and I've answered this before, I listen to the CBS hourly news, which is at the top of every hour, because that's objective news. If I want commentary, I go everywhere else. So it's true. My wife says to me, what are we watching? And I'll say CNN, Fox, and MSNBC. I no longer need to watch ABC, CBS, or NBC because they don't give me anything. They're not as dynamic as they once were. And I regret that there is no Walter Cronkite. May I just reflect personally on this? When I was at KGO, and I was there for almost 30 years, and many of you listened to me on the radio, the thing I was most touted for was my objectivity. And if I said something nice about Trump, the fury was incredible. But if Trump does something positive, it has to be reported. The Abraham Accords, for instance, were a great thing. If I say something positive about Joe Biden because of something he does, I get criticism the other way. And maybe the best way to analyze a commentator is, do you think that commentator is being fair and objective in terms of giving you information? So my answer is, unfortunately, the equal time provision has been overthrown, and we want our commentators to be more partisan. Look, I will tell you on CNN, I know who the partisans are. I know what they think. MSNBC, I know who the partisans are. I know what they think. Fox, the same. These are not news networks. These are networks that may give you news, but their commentary explains their biases.
Mhm.
When you listen to me, I'm a partisan Democrat. I support Joe Biden, but I've given it to you off the bark today in my candid observations, and I do the same thing about Donald Trump. And I'll no doubt do that about the vice presidential nominee, whoever is selected next week, believe me, or this week, will be ready for it.
Thanks. From Lucinda. I'm so mad at my beloved Times. I've always relied on print journalism to give nuanced, in-depth stories. The Times has been obsessed with Biden's age, calling for his replacement. Are you mad too?
Look, the New York Times of today is not the New York Times that I grew up with, nor is the Washington Post, nor, are you ready for this? Are you all listening attentively? Nor is the San Francisco Chronicle. It's not the same. Maybe because when I learned the trade, who, what, when, where, why, how, those were the questions a news reporter looked for. We knew there were biases. Believe me, I knew in the old days, if I can go back to this medium, that CBS was more liberal, ABC was more conservative, and NBC was down the middle. That's the way I viewed it, but it's not that way anymore. And I can't go backward. I can't go back in time to a place where I felt there was real objectivity. By the way, the fact that the New York Times is questioning Joe Biden, I want to remind you that that's what editorials are for. We need to draw a difference between editorials and news. Do you understand the difference? Editorial is an opinion, news is a statement of what is happening. And so we've crossed the line. We aren't able to distinguish anymore. And that is the fault of our news commentators and the fault of what we expect. I value the fact that when you hear from me, I try to give you an honest take from my point of view. It doesn't mean you can't disagree with me. That was the great fun of KGO. People called in and yelled at me all the time. I loved it. I'd rather have a vigorous discussion, but we don't have discussions anymore in the way we once did.
Okay, from Bob and Diane, do we need a constitutional amendment to have an age limit on the president aging out at, say, 70 or 75?
No, I'm opposed to a constitutional amendment. That is something the American people should decide. I also, by the way, had I been in Congress, would have opposed the 22nd Amendment. I don't believe in term limits. I don't believe in term limits at all. If I want to keep somebody in a job, I want to be able to keep them in a job, pure and simple. The idea of imposed limits. I'll give you an example. All of you remember my former boss, Senator Milton Marks, who served in the California State Senate for years. Now, it was time for him to retire, no question. But had he not been term limited, he would have run and he would have won again. The interesting thing is after he retired, his colleagues were still calling him to ask him, how do we solve this problem or that problem? Because Milton was a problem solver. But I would say, think about the United States Senate. I am grateful that Hubert Humphrey, Bob Dole, George McGovern, Barry Goldwater, I'm trying to use Democrats and Republicans, weren't term limited. Their continued service was invaluable. Can you imagine how America might have been different if Barry Goldwater had not led that group down to see Richard Nixon on August the 7th, 1974, to tell him it was all over? If Goldwater had been a former senator? No, I don't believe in term limits. And I don't believe that those and look, may I tell you who runs Sacramento today? Not the senators and assemblymen. It's the staff that's been there for year after year after year. I know who've worked for half a dozen different members of the various branches, because everybody has to rely on the staff because nobody's been there long enough to know how the whole deal works. It's a shame. So that's just John Rothman's opinion, which means absolutely nothing in the context of anything, because in terms of state legislature where we have term limits, we don't have it for Congress, we don't have it for the Senate, and we don't have it, and we do have it for the president, which is a shame.
All right. Anne is asking, isn't it more important that we're choosing between democracy and an autocratic government?
Yes, that's why I'm going to vote for whoever the Democrats nominate for president. I would never, by the way, I'm not here as a partisan. Let me just be clear, but you've asked a question. That's why I would never vote for Donald Trump. Donald Trump is an autocrat. He said it. He wants to have a dictatorship, at least on the first day. Nobody like that should be president of the United States of America. And for the Republican Party to accept that is absolutely ludicrous. I can just imagine the Republican elders sitting in heaven, Ronald Reagan, Dwight Eisenhower, Gerald Ford, Richard Nixon, they must be appalled at what is happening. This is, maybe we don't know enough of our history. Maybe we don't understand. But I am blessed with a memory about history, and I try to apply it fairly and evenly, although I have my partisan opinions. So the answer to the question is, I've just given it to you.
Okay, this one is a little bit long. It's from Barry. The Democratic National Convention starts August 19th, but Ohio has a rule that in order for a candidate's name to appear on the state ballot, Ohio must receive the names of each party's candidate by August 7th. How can that be legal? What would happen if either major candidate were to withdraw or die between August 7th and Election Day?
I love that question. And the answer is, what right has a state to say you've got to choose your candidate by a particular date? I mean, that's the answer. It's ludicrous. But I'll tell you what's going to happen. The Democratic National Committee will choose Joe Biden formally before the convention. They have to, because you can't not have a name on the ballot. Now, there's another question you have to ask. What happens then if a candidate for president is unable after the deadline to be on the ballot? They die there, whatever happens. Well, the answer is that's a serious question. And now, there are some states where the Democratic rooster is on the ballot, not the name of a candidate. That was the case in Alabama and Mississippi in 1960. John F. Kennedy was not on the ballot. The Democratic rooster was. But how many people vote for a party today? So this is one of the things that I hope we never encounter. I think what Ohio did was wrong. They should say, we will place on the ballot whoever is nominated by the convention of either party. But the answer will be that the Democratic National Committee will have to formally designate Joe Biden as a candidate for president before the Ohio deadline. And they will.
Okay, Nancy's asking about Woodrow Wilson. You already mentioned this. After his stroke, his wife was said to be running the country. Did people know this?
No, because there was no full disclosure. Wilson didn't hold a press conference, didn't talk to anybody. The old story of the group of senators who were called in to see Woodrow Wilson, and they propped him up on a chaise lounge and they made sure he was very secure. And a senator leaned down and said, a Republican senator leaned down and said, "Mr. President, we're praying for you." And Wilson looked up and said, "Which way, Senator? Which way?" And that's how the senators walked out saying, well, he's compos mentis. It was very unfair. And the vice president at the time was Thomas Riley Marshall, who once observed that a mother had two sons. One went to sea, the other became vice president, and never one was ever heard from again. The simple fact is that the vice presidency in those days, it was a tragedy for Thomas Riley Marshall and for America. And that's why we have a 25th Amendment. And fortunately, we haven't found ourselves in that position. But what happens if a president is incapacitated? If you read Richard Nixon's book, Six Crises, which is about his vice presidential years, plus his case, it is a fascinating book, because what the question was, Eisenhower's incapacitated. He's in Denver. He's being treated for a heart attack. When the cabinet convened, where did Nixon sit? Did he sit in Eisenhower's seat or did he stay in his own seat? He chose to stay in his own seat. There was a protocol that was established during Eisenhower's illness. And what about Eisenhower's stroke? People don't remember that in 1957, Eisenhower had a stroke. And the question again was, what would the situation be? Eisenhower was so angry that after he'd recovered or was in the midst of recovery, he said, if I can't do this job, I'm just going to quit. And he did recover and he did live on until 1969. But it's a real conundrum. And Wilson, they simply shut everything down. Wilson's press secretary was a man named Joe Tumulty, who was one of Wilson's close friends and confidants. And poor Tumulty had a terrible time. He wrote a book about it. Of course, in the end, Wilson and Tumulty broke. By the way, the other person was Robert Lansing, who was the Secretary of State in that part of the Wilson administration, who did make some indication of disagreement with the president's continuing, and he was immediately fired by Woodrow Wilson, or, if you will, by Edith Bowling Galt Wilson. But it was in the name of the president. So I throw these out to you as historical analogies because they're very relevant. And that's why, my friends, who is vice president matters tremendously. And so who Donald Trump chooses, whether it is Burgum or whether it is Rubio or whether it's J.D. Vance or someone else, it's really going to matter. And we're going to have to talk about it next week. I can't wait.
You don't think he's going to choose a woman for vice president?
The only woman who's being talked about is Elise Stefanik. She was a Rockefeller Republican who is now a Trump Republican. She replaced Liz Cheney as the number 3 Republican in the House of Representatives. Frankly, she's, I don't agree with her on virtually anything these days. Once upon a time, I liked her, but not anymore. But the point is, she could be an option, but Donald Trump is playing this very close to his vest. He hasn't announced what he's going to do. And he said something either yesterday or today that interested me. He said he wants to wait a little longer to see what the Democrats do. The premise being that by the end of the week, Biden will either be in or out as the nominee. Nobody, by the way, is talking about Biden leaving the presidency early. Somebody asked me about that. What if he resigns? He's not going to resign. And if I were Kamala Harris and Biden were to step out, the one thing I do is make sure that Joe Biden was fit enough and able enough to campaign with me all through the November election, because Biden and his policies are really the ones that will be on the ballot for people to consider in terms of a candidate.
Thank you. We have 3 more questions. Here we go from David. How can the leader of the Senate hold up or not allow a vote on the nomination of a Supreme Court nominee?
Because the rules of the Senate provide for that. If I were in the Senate, believe me, I would oppose that 100%. It's absolutely appalling. No Senate leader. And by the way, the idea of a powerful Senate leader is relatively new. It's not something, it's really a 20th century phenomenon when you have a Senate majority leader and so forth, and even minority leader. I thought it was appalling, and the Senate should have known better than to allow such a situation to occur. I hope we never have a Senate majority leader who has used his power as Mitch McConnell has. By the way, there have been Democrats. George Mitchell, when he led the Democrats in the Senate, he used the same kind of tactics. He was very tough. Mike Mansfield, who was the longest serving leader until now with McConnell, was very easy on what he did. But it just depends on the style. But it's what remember, each house makes its own rules. So the Senate writes its own rules, its own prescription for how things are to work, and the House does the same thing. Next.
Yeah, okay. Paul asks, I heard Chris Wallace say that the election will be decided by 6% of the people in 6 states.
That's true.
Is that correct? Yeah.
100%, because you're talking about the swing states and you're talking about a small number of voters who haven't made up their mind.
Wow.
By the way, that did not take a sage to conclude. It's a simple fact of the way we elect our president.
The next, we have a couple more. Dan is asking 2 parts. Is there anything we can do for swing states, like text campaigns? He says he's originally from Michigan.
No, the only thing you can do is support the parties in those states. If you want to, if they've got to get out the vote drive, that sort of thing, that's what you do. You do what you can in each state, but in the end, it's the people, the residents of those states who will make the decisions.
Okay, Linda says,
Oh, wait, may I just quickly add, I know people from California who go to Nevada prior to an election in order to lobby or to get out the vote drives and so forth. A lot of people do that. That's completely legal. And Nevada is going to be a state of great contention. And I'm sure there will be a lot of Californians doing just that in advance of November.
Okay, thank you, John. Linda says, I appreciate John's objectivity and telling us how the rest of the country views the candidates. We need to get outside the liberal bubble in Marin to understand and prepare for what could be a second Trump presidency.
I agree. Look, I'm terrified of the thought of a second Trump presidency. I'll be very honest with you. I think it's a real battle for democracy. I agree with Joe Biden. But for me, you're going to get objectivity. And I'm sure, Callum, you'll bring me back after the election to talk about those issues. And I'm sure in November, when I appear for OLLI, if Trump is president, those will be the questions on the table. But those are the kind of choices the American people will have to make. We have to make. Next question.
Okay, Lucinda says, autocrat, ? How about fascist? A number of presidential historians say Trump now fits into that category.
You know, I love using terms like fascist or communist or socialist. It's wonderful descriptions. We don't need those terms. All you got to do is take a look at where the candidate stands, for heaven's sake. Take a look at where Joe Biden stands and where Donald Trump stands. Donald Trump accuses Joe Biden of being a communist or a fascist or you know, all these things. These are terms which we can define. I've taught courses on the meaning of these political terms. But what's important in this election will be to define where the candidates stand. What I do is I take a piece of paper and I write the 10 key issues down, and then I draw a line down the paper and I say where they stand on each one of these issues. That's how I decide whether someone is someone acceptable or not. I would agree that Donald Trump does exude authoritarianism, but a strict definition of fascism, I've always declined to use terms like fascist or communist. Look, we went through red baiting. We went through the days when there's a new book out, by the way, on communists in San Francisco, which I'm going to read this weekend. All I can tell you is forget the terms and talk about the issues. If you talk about issues and where people stand and you can draw a difference between you and them, you're in a lot stronger territory.
All right. Thank you, John. That's it for questions right now, unless anyone else has any other questions they want to add or wants to unmute, perhaps. So I'll hand it over to you, John. It's up to you. We don't need to use the extra time. It's entirely up to you.
Well, let me just suggest, first of all, everybody should watch the Republican National Convention. You want to watch it carefully, see what they say and how they say it, because we will talk about that next week. We have to look very carefully at who Donald Trump chooses as his vice presidential running mate. What are the implications of that? I want to suggest to you that tonight, when the president speaks from the White House about, and I think it's from the White House, about NATO and how he articulates that, it'll be critical. On Thursday, when the president holds a free-for-all press conference, at least that's what we're told it will be, we have to watch that as well. I am going to be watching today. Now, when I came into this class with you, I had not yet heard all of the reaction from members of the House of Representatives, the Democrats, who met today to talk about Joe Biden and his future. What will that be? And we still don't know whether the Senate Democrats are going to get together to try to deal with these issues. In short, I can assure you that I could sit here for days, weeks, months, and still not run out of things to talk about. And I wouldn't have to repeat myself very often either, because the dynamic of this election is so fantastic, and the depth of the discussions should be vigorous. So, I mean, I'm happy to answer any question, and I can assure you each week will be different, but you have homework assignments now. Have
I
to
think
watch.
Lucinda may have a question. I'm not sure.
No, it's not a question, just a comment, because somebody asked what can they do about the swing states? Postcard writing campaigns have been going on for years. There's a number of organizations. I've done them. My sister has literally done thousands of them and pays for all the printing and the postage.
That's
And
great. Yeah,
yeah.
I agree. Except how many of you throw away junk mail? And that's one of the key problems.
These are handwritten postcards.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. People know, but sure, write the letters. I think it's better to go to a state and canvass myself, but it all works. And in the end, you're not dealing with broad masses of people. You're dealing with a small group of undecided voters. And what we learn from the debate is somebody's decision can change based on what happens at a particular moment. But I agree with you, letter writing, postcard writing, phone calling, phone banking. That's the other thing people do. Except I don't know about you, I get all these crank calls, I just hang up the phone. In fact, when I'm dealing with all of you, I have both my phones, my landlines off the hook, because otherwise the phone will be ringing constantly. So it's all a question of what you choose. When I tell people what the best thing to do is, if you know people in those states, call them and talk to them individually. If you know them, it has a lot more credibility. Not that I'm disparaging any other attempt to influence votes in swing states. By the way, if they're radio talk shows, unfortunately, in San Francisco and Northern California, we don't have any talk radio stations. If you can call them to talk radio stations in a state like Michigan, or in a state like Pennsylvania, or a state like Wisconsin, it's very useful, because then you have a voice that people hear. You just have to make sure your message is tight.
I heard, by the way, about Michigan, I heard that Biden's losing a lot of votes in the Arab population.
Well, he may be, but the leading progressives and pro-Palestinian voices in the House have just all endorsed Biden in the last few hours.
Oh,
Rashida Tlaib and the others, they're all backing Biden.
good. All right.
So you never know. And let me promise you something. Every day is going to bring new developments. If you ask my wife, she will tell you, I turn on the news in the middle of the night because I'm compulsive. I want to know what's happening. And who could have predicted 2 weeks ago the debate performance, so-called debate performance, of Joe Biden? And who knows what Donald Trump will do? Who could have predicted what the Supreme Court would rule in terms of presidential immunity? Who could have predicted that he would be convicted of 34 felony charges? Now, the question is, what leaves an impact? What makes a difference? Are people's minds changed by developments, or do people say this is all predictable? Well, let me tell you, what happened in that joint appearance was not predictable. No one anticipated that Joe Biden would perform the way he did. And we have a long way to go before November 5th.
Okay, John, thank you so much. I'm going to give one last call. If there's a last minute question from anyone, this is your chance. And after that, we will wind it up. And if there's no last question, I'm not hearing one.
Well, let me just point out, if this were my class and there were no questions, somebody would fail. May I suggest one thing? I know there are always a lot of questions. Before we do these sessions, we have 3 more sessions. You might want to write questions down, because news changes. So give yourself a chance to think about the kind of questions you'd want to ask based on a whole week of activity. I think that also helps you, but I think we're pretty much on time, aren't we, Colin?
We're a little early, it's fine. But there is one last question here, which I think is kind of interesting. Paul asks, do you think Trump might appoint Don Jr. as his VP running mate?
No chance of that. I think what you're going to see is one of the people I've mentioned, Tim Scott, Elise Stefanik, Doug Burgum, Marco Rubio, or J.D. Vance. Those are the candidates, I think. Although, who would have predicted Spiro Agnew in 1968? Really and truly. Who was Agnew on anybody's list? Not really. And I would point out to you, if I had suggested to you that Mike Pence would be the nominee 8 years ago, who Mike Pence wasn't on anybody's real list. So it's always interesting. And
Let
by
me
the way,
throw
the
in-
first
let me
major
throw this in.
decision a candidate for president makes is who the vice presidential nominee will be. And that's why we really have to examine it.
How about Ivanka?
Ivanka?
Yeah.
No, yeah, listen, anybody who thinks that dynasties are going to be created, my wife just bought us tickets to see Evita. This is not a country of Peronists. We don't go to our wives or our cousins and so forth. Nobody asked me a question about Hunter Biden today, which is great, because Hunter Biden isn't president of the United States, but he is a major issue for the Republicans. So all of these things will play out. We'll see. That's why the Republican convention will be so interesting. I can't wait for that convention to take place.
All right. Thank you so much.
I
Thank
have a
you,
question.
everyone.
One more question.
Oh, David has a question.
Question about the electoral college. Why do states pick the electors based on the winner of the popular vote? Why not pick the electors based on the 45% Democrat and 55 Republican in that state, rather than the Republicans getting all the votes, or vice versa?
Those are the rules. Now we could
Right.
change the rules. And by the way, if you want, one day I'll teach a course on the Electoral College. It's very interesting. It has been proposed that electors be chosen by congressional district. We mentioned that earlier, in which case Nixon would have defeated Kennedy because Nixon carried more congressional districts than Kennedy did. Or you could go to a straight popular vote, or you could do what 2 states have done, of where congressional districts is by congressional district, which I just mentioned. But that's the way we've done it. Does it mean that it's the only way it can be done? No. Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., when he was a United States Senator back in the 1940s, proposed a change in the Electoral College. Interesting enough, if his changes had been accepted, Nixon would have defeated Kennedy. So, and we now are in a situation where we don't have landslide elections. We haven't had a landslide election in years. These are close elections. And the way it's been decided is states vote as a unit. Is it fair? Well, that's the way we do it. And there will always be talk about there's this compact of the states they're talking about where the person who wins the popular vote in the state carries the state. That wouldn't apply for what you would like to see, which is a proportional arrangement.
Right.
And no one has suggested that in a creditable way that I've seen. I just don't see it.
Hey, John,
Yeah.
have in talking about changes, polls seem tremendously inaccurate for a number of years. Were they always like that?
Just ask President Landon. The Literary Digest poll, which had not been wrong in an election, at 1916 they started, they were right on the money until 1936. They predicted Landon would defeat Roosevelt. And in the end, the old expression is Maine goes, so goes the nation. Well, it was as Maine goes, so goes Vermont. And of course, you can say the same thing about 1948 with Thomas E. Dewey. One of my prized possessions is a Kiplinger magazine, What Dewey Will Do, all about President-elect Thomas E. Dewey. Everybody predicted Dewey would win. Polls are, well, what we now know, and which we always knew but intellectually weren't willing to accept, is that popular vote polls don't matter. It's state by state. Somebody pointed out to me, if Trump lost the popular vote by 10 million votes, but he carried all the swing states, he'd still be elected president of the United States. So it's an interesting anomaly. We are a nation with certain electoral traditions, What bothers me more than anything else is Donald Trump's statement that he'll accept the result if he wins, but if he doesn't, and of course, the one question which should have been asked at the joint appearance was, who won the 2020 election? Trump would have said he won it. He didn't. Joe Biden did. But as I like to point out, don't confuse some people with the facts.
One final comment from Linda here. She's asking if next week we could talk about the impact of the Supreme Court ruling on presidential immunity.
Well, I'll answer that right now. We have 2 minutes. I'll do it.
Sure.
The impact is that Donald Trump won a sweeping victory, which, by the way, it shouldn't have happened. Logically, they should simply accepted the United States versus Richard Nixon. But then again, in my judgment, Roe v. Wade should never have been overthrown. We have a Supreme Court that some would call a rogue court. I don't think it's a rogue court. It's an intentionally defined court. Remember that Donald Trump, to his credit, prior to the election of 2016, announced that if he were elected president of the United States, he would put justices on the Supreme Court who would rescind Roe v. Wade, and he did just that. I can only tell you I was shocked by the decision. It was a 5-4 decision that elected Al Gore as president, rather George Bush as president. So the court has its own method of working, but there is a conservative majority on the court. It now is a 6-3 vote, and we're going to have to live with it until there are vacancies. But if Donald Trump is elected president, the Supreme Court will take a sharp right turn. If Joe Biden is reelected, and assuming he has 2 or 3 vacancies, the court will go back to what we have known as a liberal court. And many of you have listened to me over the years on the radio and in my public addresses know that I said we don't just elect a president, we elect the person who will nominate people for the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decision was a terrible decision from the point of view of the American presidency. No one should be above the law. And although we have executive privilege, I would refer you to Warren Berger's comment that if it's a criminal matter, there's no executive privilege. For those of us who believe that Donald Trump committed crimes, all you have to do is read Vice President Pence's book about what happened to him on January 6th. All you have to do is read the January 6th report. If you've not read Liz Cheney's book, you have to read it. It's one of the finest books on the situation you'd ever imagine. But people have political opinions. They're unmoved by them. So as to presidential immunity, I think it was a blow, but hopefully we will recover from it. I hope the words of John Adams prevail. They're engraved on a fireplace at the White House, that none but wise people should ever live in this house. And that
I wish. John, one question here from Bonnie, and then we're going to close. Bonnie, go ahead.
Yes, John, Congressman Adam Schiff said that if he wins the Senate race, he is going to propose that we extend the number, legislation to extend the number of judges appointed to the Supreme Court to make the balance more fair than what it is now.
Unless the wrong president makes the nominations. Adam Schiff's, I'm supporting Adam. I like him very much. He's wrong. The court shouldn't be expanded. Because what it means is that it becomes even more political in terms of who is president. What we have to do is to realize that who is president of the United States matters. But I think expanding the court to reduce the conservative impact is a mistake, and I don't think it will happen. Although that through history, there have been various numbers on the Supreme Court. But I'm opposed, just as some of you remember, I don't know how many of you regular OLLI students heard my course on Franklin D. Roosevelt, and I spent a lot of time on the court packing of 1937. Roosevelt decided he would expand the court to 15 members. Fortunately, it didn't work. It was a formula, if you were over 70, that an alternate justice was appointed, which brought it to 15. That was opposed by Republicans and Democrats. So I'm opposed to expanding the Supreme Court. But just remember, if the court were expanded, but Donald Trump were elected and the court had been expanded, he would have more justices to appoint. There's just no guarantee. So we're comfortable with 9. And the trick is to have the right president making the nominations. I go back to Shirley Breyer Black. If Al Gore had won in 2000, if he'd been inaugurated as president, the whole course of history would have been different. So it's a very important question, but on that I dissent. But Adam Schiff will be the next United States Senator from California and will be well represented. He's a very able fellow. Nobody asked me, by the way, the comparison between Dianne Feinstein, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and Joe Biden, because most people will say they wish Ruth Bader Ginsburg had retired earlier. Dianne Feinstein, it didn't matter because in the end we had a Democratic governor. But if we'd had a Republican governor, you realize there would have been a Republican appointed to that seat. Joe Biden, well, in the end, that will be the discretion of the American people. And let me tell you, anything can happen in the next week. So tonight, you're all going to watch what he says to the NATO leaders. You're going to watch him Thursday. This is your homework assignment. Because the only way we can deal with this is by watching and listening and hoping for the best, which is what I do. I'm an eternal optimist, ladies and gentlemen. I am never a pessimist. I always think things can only get better. It's a good way to live, I think.
Thank you, John.
What time
Thank you
tonight?
so much.
What channel? What channel?
What channel tonight?
Yeah, for the NATO.
CNN, MSNBC, Fox. I'm sure they'll all carry
Gotcha.
what Joe Biden says. I'm not sure of the timing on it, but probably around 4 or 5 our time. And then for the press conference on Thursday, again, I'm sure all the networks will carry it. How can you not? Of course,
Hopefully,
NBC,
yeah.
CBS, ABC, who knows?
Okay, John, thank you so much. And
Thank
we will see
you.
you next week.
May I say thank you? I appreciate it and I look forward to it very much.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Bye.
Okay, thank you. Great lesson. Bye-bye.
You got us thinking.
You want me to stay on?
No, it's good. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.